False pride says, I'm better than you. Real pride says, I'm better than I was. One isolates you, the other connects you. And in recovery, that difference is everything.
You've tried to quit before. Maybe it worked for a while. Maybe it didn't. But deep down, you know sobriety isn't just about not drinking. It's about finding peace, purpose, and finding yourself again. Welcome to the Sober and Happy Podcast. Each week, Tim shares hard-earned lessons from his own decade of recovery, real talk, real methods, and the mindset that helped him turn the fight of sobriety into a life he actually loves. This is the Sober and Happy Podcast. Now, here's your host, Tim Phillips.
Welcome back, my friends. Last week, we talked about what it takes to start believing in yourself again, rebuilding self-trust after years of broken promises. This week, I want to talk about what comes next, becoming someone you could be proud of. Now, I know for some of you, even hearing the word pride might make you uncomfortable, especially if, like me, you came from a recovery background where pride was seen as a character defect. Now, if you spent any time in AA, you've probably heard that message loud and clear. The big book talks a lot about pride, but always as something dangerous. Pride is described as the root of our problems and sometimes the biggest barrier to growth. And to be fair, what they were talking about was false pride, the ego that says, I don't need help, or I've got this all figured out. That kind of pride absolutely could block growth and connection. It's the armor that we build to avoid facing ourselves. But somewhere along the way, I think that distinction got lost. Because the meetings I went to didn't make that separation. Pride of any kind was often shamed. If you said you felt proud about your progress, someone would quickly remind you to stay humble or warn you that pride comes before a fall. And I get where that comes from. It's meant as protection, not judgment. But here's the truth. There's a different kind of pride that doesn't come from ego. It comes from integrity, from effort, from change. False pride says, I'm better than you. Healthy pride says, I'm better than I was. One isolates you, the other connects you. One feeds denial, the other one fuels your growth. And in recovery, that difference is everything. Because when you strip away all the chaos and noise, recovery isn't about avoiding a drink. It's about building a life that actually feels worth living. And that starts with being proud of who you're becoming. That's what I want to talk about today. How to build a kind of pride that doesn't inflate your ego, but heals your self-worth. Because before I understood the difference between false pride and real pride, I lived almost entirely in the first kind. You know, back when I was drinking, I had plenty of pride, but it wasn't the kind that helped me. It was the kind that says, I don't have a problem. The kind that kept me from asking for help because I didn't want to admit that I didn't have it all together. The kind that made me double down on bad choices just to prove a point, even when I knew I was wrong. That's false pride. It's the armor I was talking about. It's fragile, and it crumbles the moment someone sees through it. In those days, pride was about protecting the image of who I wanted people to think I was, instead of building the foundation of who I actually wanted to be. And I clung to that image right down to the bitter end. When it became obvious to everyone, including me, that I had a drinking problem, I started looking for other ways to convince myself I was still doing better than other people. Maybe it was, yeah, I drink too much, but at least I make more money than that guy. But eventually, the money went away too. And when there wasn't anything external left to measure myself against, I started picking apart other people's flaws. I'd look for their worst character defects, not just so I could feel better about myself, but so I'd have ammunition ready if anyone dared to call me out on mine. That's when I started losing even more friends, not because of my drinking itself, but because of the person I became trying to defend it. These were friends who had tolerated my drinking, but were still genuinely concerned about me. It wasn't my behavior when I was drunk that pushed them away. It was my wounded pride. That's the thing about false pride. It isolates you. It convinces you that vulnerability is weakness when it's actually the only thing that could set you free. Real pride, on the other hand, doesn't need to defend anything. It's not loud or defensive. It's quiet, it's grounded, and it's honest. Real pride shows up when your actions start to match your values, when you keep a promise to yourself, when you show up for someone else, not because you're trying to prove anything, but because it's simply the right thing to do. I used to think pride was something you achieved once you reached some imaginary level of success. Now I see it something that you earn one honest day at a time. Real pride doesn't make you feel bigger than other people. It just makes you feel at peace with yourself. It's not the voice that says, I got this. It's the one that quietly whispers, I'm finally becoming who I was meant to be. But before we could feel that kind of pride, we have to understand what happens when it's gone, because losing pride changes everything. When you lose pride in yourself, life starts to feel really small. It's like walking around with your shoulders hunched, not because anyone told you to do so, but because deep down, you don't believe you deserve to stand tall anymore. When I was deep in my drinking, I didn't just lose control. I lost respect for myself. Every lie I told, every promise I broke, every never again I didn't keep, it all chipped away at the person I wanted to be. At some point, I wasn't even trying to get better anymore. I was just trying not to feel worse. That's what happens when pride disappears. You stop aiming for growth and you start aiming for survival. You lower the bar for what okay means just so you can make it through another day. And here's the cruel part. The less proud you feel, the harder it becomes to do anything that might make you feel proud again. You start believing that you don't deserve better. That's when the cycle really digs in. You tell yourself, why bother? You convince yourself that trying again will just prove you're still broken. And you start to mistake self-loathing for humility, as if beating yourself up is somehow the price you have to keep paying for who you were during your addiction. That's not humility. That's hopelessness wearing a disguise. The truth is, when you lose pride, you lose your sense of direction. You stop building, stop thriving, stop showing up for yourself, because deep down, you don't see anyone worth showing up for. The good news is, pride can be rebuilt. It's not some personality trait you're born with. It's something you earn back through small, honest choices. And when you start to rebuild, everything shifts. You go from trying to avoid failure to trying to create a life that actually feels worth living. And the way you start creating that life isn't through huge leaps. It's through small, consistent steps. Here's the thing about pride. You don't rebuild it through big, dramatic moments. You rebuild it quietly through consistency. Pride grows every time your actions line up with your values, even in small ways. Like every time you follow through on something you said you'd do. Every time you show up when it would have been easier not to. When I first got sober, I thought the key to feeling proud again was to fix everything I'd broken, to become this new and improved version of myself overnight. That's why I set these huge goals. Lose weight, rebuild every relationship, get financially stable, find purpose, everything all at once. And I did do great for a while. But the moment I slipped, that old voice came back. See, you always fall apart. You'll never change. It took me a long time to realize pride doesn't come from doing everything right. It comes from doing the right next thing. It's not perfection that rebuilds your confidence. It's repetition. It's proving to yourself one small promise at a time that you could be trusted again. That's why consistency matters so much more than intensity. Anybody could go all in for a week. Anybody could have one perfect day. But pride, real pride, is built when you keep showing up, even on the days that don't look impressive. That's the shift that changes everything. Moving from trying to impress people to trying to respect yourself. And that line actually takes me back to when I first got sober in AA. In the beginning, I did exactly what I was told. I went to meetings, worked the steps, took every service commitment I could get, sponsored guys, and said yes whenever I was asked. And I showed up early to meetings and I stayed late. And honestly, that structure was good for me. It taught me how to follow through and how to keep my word again. After a while, some of the old timers started noticing. They'd use me as an example of what working the program looked like. And after so many years of being an example of what not to do, that felt good. And I felt proud. But looking back, that pride wasn't coming from authenticity. It was coming from ego. I wasn't living in alignment with what I actually believed. I was performing a version of recovery that kept other people happy. And that kept me feeling validated. The more I was praised for being the guy who was doing it right, the more pressure I felt to stay that guy, even when part of me started to question things. That's how false pride sneaks in. It looks like progress from the outside, but inside, you're just trying not to lose the approval that's keeping you afloat. It took me a long time to realize I wasn't actually growing. I was just maintaining an image. I was staying sober, but I wasn't being authentic. And without authenticity, you can't build real pride, because pride without truth is just a performance. That's when I started learning that consistency isn't about living up to someone else's expectations. It's about living in a way that earns your own respect. Because when you keep those little promises, especially the ones that no one even knows about, something powerful happens. You start to believe that your word means something again. And when that happens, the guilt starts to fade and the peace starts to take its place. For me, one of the first times I actually felt real pride again wasn't even tied to a big achievement or milestone. It was something very simple. It happened about a year into sobriety with my friend Jack. Now, Jack has known me since we were kids, and through most of my drinking, he'd put up with a lot. He was the kind of loyal friend who gives you more patience than you probably deserved. He'd call me out when I messed up, but he never gave up on me. Over time, though, he learned that if we made plans, there was a good chance I wouldn't show up. Either I'd forget that we made plans because I was blacked out drunk at the time, or I'd flake, or I'd cancel at the last minute. So even after I got sober, he kept up the same routine. Whenever we made plans, he'd call or text several times to remind me. It wasn't really nagging, although it felt like it at some times. It was a habit built out of necessity. It was the only way for years he could make sure that I'd actually show up. Then one weekend, about a year into sobriety, I'd promised to help him with something early on a Saturday morning. I remember thinking the night before, I'm surprised he hasn't called or texted to remind me yet. Then that morning came, still no text, no call, nothing. I actually started to worry that something might actually be wrong, but I went anyways. I showed up when I said I would. Later that afternoon after we were done, I asked him why he hadn't checked in on me like he normally did. He just looked at me and he said, I don't need to anymore. That hit me hard in the best way, because that was the first time in a long time that I didn't just say I was dependable. I actually was. That was the moment I realized that pride doesn't come from convincing people. It comes from living in a way that proves it without needing to say a word. It wasn't about earning anyone's approval or trying to make up for the past. It was about integrity, quietly keeping a promise, even when no one was watching. It didn't feel like some huge breakthrough, just a quiet moment of realizing I'd finally started becoming the type of person I truly wanted to become. That's when it really started to click for me, that living in alignment with who you want to be doesn't have to be flashy. It just has to be honest. And one of the biggest changes you start to notice once that honesty takes root is how it transforms the way you see your past. Because here's the truth, no matter how long we've been sober, there's still going to be moments when the past sneaks up on us. Maybe it's a memory, a smell, a place, or a random thought that brings up something in your past that you desperately wish you could redo. For me, one of those things was how I wasn't there for my mom when she needed me most of the time while I was drinking. Even now, all these years later, that memory could still hit like a punch in the gut. But here's what's different now. I've made my amends. I've changed. I could look at that same memory and say, yeah, that happened, but I'm not that man anymore. That shift from guilt to grounded pride is everything. Because in recovery, you're going to have moments where old shame tries to convince you that you really haven't changed. It'll whisper, don't get too confident. Remember what you did? But when you've done the work, when you've rebuilt trust with yourself, you have something to stand on. You could look that shame in the eye and say, you're right, I did that, but I'm not running from it anymore, and I'm living in a way that makes it right. That's the beautiful thing about pride. Not the ego-driven kind, but the kind that's earned. It doesn't erase the past, but it reframes it. Pride says, yes, that's part of my story, but it's not the whole story. And when you could hold your head up and say that with honesty, not defensiveness, not denial, just truth, that's freedom. That's peace. That's when guilt stops being a weight that drags you down and becomes a reminder of how far you've come. Here's the truth. Becoming someone you could be proud of isn't about having it all figured out. It's about being able to look yourself in the mirror and know that you're showing up with honesty, even when it's messy. We spend so much time in recovery trying to fix the past or plan the future that we forget that the real work happens in small, ordinary moments when nobody's watching. The morning you keep your word to yourself and get out of bed instead of hitting snooze. The time you speak up for yourself instead of staying quiet to keep the peace. The day you choose to forgive yourself instead of replaying the same mistake in your head over and over again. Those are the quiet victories that rebuild self-respect. Because when you start stacking enough of those moments together, something powerful happens. You stop trying to escape your life and start wanting to live it. And maybe that's the simplest measure of growth, when you could finally say, I'm proud of how I handled that. That doesn't mean you're perfect. It means you're becoming the kind of person who shows up for yourself and for the people who matter most. Recovery isn't about escaping who you were. It's about proving who you could become. Every day is a choice to drift back into old habits or take one small step towards the life you actually want. You don't have to move fast. You just have to keep moving with honesty and intention. And then one day you'll look back and realize that you didn't just rebuild your life. You rebuilt yourself. Until next time, my friends, thank you so much for listening and keep living sober and happy.
Thanks for listening to the Sober and Happy podcast with Tim Phillips. If today's episode connected with you, share it with someone who needs it. You can follow Tim on social at I Am Sober and Happy and visit soberandhappy.com for tools, motivation, and more episodes. Remember, quitting drinking is just the beginning. The real goal is learning to love yourself and love your life. This has been the Sober and Happy podcast. See you next time.